If the US goes to war in Venezuela, that's going to matter for everyone. 25% of its Navy arsenal is currently deployed to the Caribbean. The government is telling its citizens to urgently leave Venezuela, and Trump announced the country's airspace is closed. Since early September, the US military has killed at least 87 people in strikes on boats allegedly carrying drugs, claims made without evidence.
Extrajudicial killings are war crimes, so imagine in times of peace.
These are the first airstrikes carried out by the US in Latin America, or at least the first they've acknowledged since the invasion of Panama in 1989. And while the US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America, this can be better understood as a spiritual sequel to a more recent US military campaign.
The recharacterization of organized crime as a form of terrorism, it's dangerous.
While the prospect of a war in Venezuela and the destabilizing effects it'll have on the region should already be concerning for hundreds of millions of people, the more I've read about this, the more worried I've become about the broader implications for everyone else. So first, let's go over what we know about these strikes. On August 20th, the US deployed warships to the Caribbean, including a nuclear-powered submarine, and later added the USS Gerald Ford to that fleet. That's the largest warship in the world. Less than 2 weeks after that deployment started, on September 2nd, they announced the first strike against what they said were positively identified narco-terrorists from the criminal organization Tren de Aragua with this video. Then 2 more strikes followed, on September 15th and 19th, and they went on to carry out 5 strikes in the Caribbean in October, 4 more in the Eastern Pacific, and this is continuing into November. But looking at all of these strikes, there are 3 important things to understand. 1, the government has not offered any evidence that these were drug smuggling boats. In no way were they positively identified. In fact, several of them probably weren't, and the Venezuelan government said that the victims had no ties to organized crime. Now, to be fair, I would expect the Venezuelan government to say that anyway, but we don't need to take them at their word. Because these are small boats with very little space. The boat struck on September 2nd had 11 people, and Trump said it was loaded with a lot of drugs on board. A boat that size doesn't need a crew of 11 people. It only needs a couple of people, and when you're smuggling drugs, you need to make sure that the boat is as light as possible so you have space for enough drugs to be worth the trip, so you don't take a bunch of extra people on board. It's almost inconceivable that they would have had that many people on a drug-running boat. Now, it still could have been a Tren de Aragua boat of some kind of criminal activity or another, I don't know, human trafficking or whatever, but they're not even claiming that. They're just saying it was drugs, which we know almost for sure in this case that it wasn't. And without any evidence otherwise, they might have been tourists. They might have been a family gone fishing. We will likely never know. And the administration seems to be acknowledging that they might be killing civilians.
I was talking to Secretary Hegseth, and you know what he said? He said, you know what, Mr. Vice President? We don't see any of these drug boats coming into our country. They've completely stopped. And I said, I know why. I would stop too. Hell, I wouldn't go fishing right now in that area of the world.
General Kane said, sir, there are no boats out there. Not even fishing boats. They don't want to go fishing. I don't blame them. There'll be no fishing today, you know.
Meanwhile, the government of Colombia, which is a US ally, said the victims of the September 15th strike include a Colombian father on a fishing trip. The Trump administration responded to that by imposing sanctions on Colombia and calling its president a drug dealer. And reportedly, the Dominican Republic had recovered 377 packages of cocaine floating in the sea after a strike on September 19th. And I'm not going to say that is definitely not true, but this is the strike in question. And these are the packages of cocaine supposedly recovered from that boat, which seem to be in miraculously good condition to me. But that brings us to point 2. Yes, drug smuggling is a crime, but even if these are drug runners, the US government doesn't have the right to summarily execute them on sight.
International law doesn't provide any legal basis whatsoever to do anything of this sort.
This is Violeta Moreno-Lax, the Vubin Foundation Professor of International Law at the Hertie School. She's a pretty big deal among international law experts, and you'll see more of her in an upcoming video.
The legal basis that one could invoke are under the law of the sea. You would need to say that it's a case of piracy, and what the law of the sea would allow you to do is to detain the people and take them to your jurisdiction for trial, but you cannot shoot them dead. I mean, that's something, that's an extrajudicial killing. Extrajudicial killings are war crimes. So imagine in times of peace. What about the presumption of innocence? What about due process guarantees? What about evidence in court? The other instrument that you could look at for a legal basis to intervene in this way would be the UN Transnational Organized Crime Convention. But also in that regard, you have the possibility of detaining a vessel suspected of carrying drugs or other illegal material for the purposes of taking the people to your jurisdiction for trial.
Which is something that they do all the time.
If you go off the coast of Miami, the Coast Guard will be stopping boats today, and about 25% of the boats that they stop, that they're suspicious of drugs, there won't be any drugs on board. So 25% of the time the suspicion is wrong, and that's why we don't shoot and just blow up boats off of Miami, but neither should we be blowing them up off the coast of Venezuela.
And point number 3, the administration, or Trump specifically, said that the drugs were heading for the US, and they've given no evidence of that. In fact, at least one of the boats was not headed in that direction at all. The first boat, struck on September 2nd, was apparently heading in the direction of Trinidad and Tobago, which would not be consistent with routes sending drugs to the US. It could be consistent with sending them to Europe, but even that is pure speculation since we don't even know if there were any drugs on board. And reportedly, when they noticed that they were being followed by US military aircraft, they freaked out, turned around, heading back towards Venezuela, and that's when the US opened fire. And it only got worse from there. Before the strike, according to reporting by the Washington Post, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he likes to call himself the Secretary of War, gave the order to kill them all. After the initial strike, 2 survivors were seen clinging to the wreckage on the drone feed, leading Admiral Frank Bradley of the US Special Operations Command to strike the boats again in accordance with the kill order from Hegseth. If it was already clear before that these strikes were war crimes, so much so that the UK actually stopped sharing intelligence with the US on these boats because they didn't want their information to be instrumental in committing war crimes, now it's unambiguous. Every legal doctrine on the laws of war, from international law to even US law, specifically says that showing no quarter to wounded enemies and explicitly to the shipwrecked is a war crime. And the government doesn't deny that there were survivors and they hit them again. They just deny that Hegseth was personally in the loop in that moment, but they claim that Bradley acted within his authority. So how do they justify all of this? Essentially, the Trump administration's narrative starts with the opioid crisis in the United States, which kills tens of thousands of Americans each year. Deaths that they attribute to fentanyl being smuggled into the country. They blame that on a number of cartels, including Tren de Aragua, or TDA, this Venezuelan criminal organization. And they say the Venezuelan government and Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro himself are directly in charge of TDA and personally telling them to target the United States, not only with drugs, but with illegal immigration, which they refer to as an invasion. This is the whole basis for the US declaring TDA and other gangs and cartels terrorist organizations and invoking the Alien Enemies Act against TDA in March, 2 months after he took office. And this whole chain here is the basis for the military deployment to the Caribbean and the strikes we've been talking about. The problem is, all of this completely falls apart under scrutiny. So let's start with the opioid crisis, which is estimated to have killed over 700,000 Americans since 1999. For the most part, this crisis can be traced back to pharmaceutical companies at best misleading doctors about the addiction risks of their drugs and at worst bribing them to overprescribe opioid painkillers. These are companies like Purdue Pharma who pled guilty for their role in the crisis, as well as other companies like Johnson & Johnson, Walmart, CVS, Walgreens, who collectively paid billions in nationwide settlements, but also consulting companies like McKinsey, who settled and admitted wrongdoing for their work with Purdue Pharma to help supercharge their sales. They were also helped by lawyers like Rudy Giuliani, who managed to get them a deal where they could continue selling Oxy after they were already convicted and the dangers of Oxy were already largely documented. And it's also worth noting that the billions they made in settlements were pennies on the dollar compared to what they made selling those drugs. But nonetheless, this led to a huge addiction crisis, and once those prescriptions ran out, those patients turned to illegal drugs like heroin and, yes, fentanyl. Now, the problem for the Trump administration is there is zero fentanyl coming from Venezuela. Not from TDA, not from anyone else in Venezuela. That's not just me saying it, it's even Republicans like Senator Rand Paul.
There is no fentanyl made in Venezuela. Not just a little bit, there's none being made in Venezuela.
The chemicals used to make fentanyl come from China, and production is done overwhelmingly by the Sinaloa Cartel or Jalisco New Generation in Mexico. And these do not tie back to TDA. In fact, even without counting fentanyl, the Trump administration's claim that TDA is bringing in large amounts of drugs into the US, there's no evidence of that. This is a 350-page report from the US State Department called the International Narcotics Control Strategy Report from March of this year. The same month Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act against TDA. But the difference is this report wasn't written by political appointees. It was written by experts at the State Department. And the only drug activity attributed to TDA in this report by Trump's own experts is micro drug trafficking. In other words, street-level drug trafficking. Because TDA isn't a cartel, they're not involved in large-scale drug smuggling. They're a transnational criminal organization. They're involved in a whole lot of other really bad things, like protection rackets, human trafficking, prostitution, kidnap for ransom, retail theft, and plenty more. Which is bad, but not drug smuggling. As for the allegation of the Venezuelan government being directly in control of TDA, there's no evidence of this. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because the Trump administration claims this link actually goes through another organization called the Cartel de los Soles, or Cartel of the Suns, which is allegedly led by high-ranking officials in the Venezuelan military, with Maduro's second-in-command, Diosdado Cabello, at the top. And allegedly Soles also works with the Sinaloa cartel. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. There's plenty of evidence of members of the Venezuelan military and elected officials profiting from drug trafficking. But the very existence of the Cartel de los Soles is disputed. At most, it's largely believed to be an informal, loose-knit network of members of the Venezuelan military involved in drug trafficking to make up for the Venezuelan government's terrible finances and the fact that the Venezuelan military wasn't even being paid for a while. And this started with help from the CIA, which in the 90s oversaw shipments of cocaine through Venezuela into the US as a way of infiltrating Colombian cartels. But the existence of the Cartel of the Suns is so unsubstantiated that it's not even mentioned once in the Trump administration's own 350-page strategy report on narcotics. Nor does it mention any other ties between the Venezuelan government and either TDA or the Sinaloa cartel. In fact, the report attributes the existence of TDA to, quote, low-level corruption and lack of state control rather than the government being involved in the organization. So despite all the name recognition of Tren de Aragua,
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 which largely comes from extensive media coverage of their alleged involvement in running an apartment complex in Colorado, which Republicans made a huge deal about during the campaign, and it's reasonable to be concerned by that, but they are at most a minor player in international drug smuggling. And yet, in all of the posts on Truth Social announcing strikes on boats in the Caribbean, TDA is the only organization that is mentioned. When he doesn't mention TDA, he just generically talks about a designated terrorist organization or extraordinarily violent drug trafficking cartels and narco-terrorists. That word, terrorists or narco-terrorists, is really important because essentially the Trump administration's legal rationale is 1. Drugs kill people in the United States.
300 million people died last year from drugs.
Well, not that many. It's usually between 80 and 100,000 a year, which is still bad. 2. Deliberately and indiscriminately killing people in the US, whether it's with guns or bombs or drugs, which they equate with poison.
We want to make sure that our young people stop dying of this terrible poison, this fentanyl and other drugs.
If you try to poison our people, we will blow you out of existence.
Stop the killing, stop the poisoning of the American people.
By that logic, that's terrorism, same as if it were anthrax. And 3, a cartel, especially a foreign cartel bringing drugs into the US, is therefore a terrorist group.
A lot of them, we've called them a terrorist organization, which is actually a big thing to do. Nobody's done it, but I've done it with a lot of them. It gives you a tremendous advantage.
The recharacterization of organized crime as a form of terrorism, it's dangerous because you could consider any group of 3 that engages in a crime that has a transnational dimension a terrorist organization.
They describe this as narco-terrorism. The problem is that's not what narco-terrorism is.
The link between traffic in narcotics and terrorism, it's not that it doesn't exist. I mean, there is ways in which terrorism is being financed that is directly linked to drug trafficking and trafficking in other illegal goods. So I'm not going to deny that there is in many occasions, a direct link between the two.
But narco-terrorism isn't just dealing drugs that kill people, it's terrorist activities associated with drug trafficking. One definition would be attempts by narcotics traffickers to influence the policies of a government or a society through violence and intimidation, and to hinder the enforcement of anti-drug laws by the systematic threat or use of such violence, or alternatively, the financing of terrorist activities by participating in the drug trade, neither of which applies to the Trump administration's rationale. But that doesn't matter, because we've been looking at all of this backwards. What matters is if they can stretch the definition of narco-terrorism enough to include drug smuggling, which it doesn't, and if they can paint TDA as a cartel, which it's not, and if they can claim the Venezuelan government and Nicolas Maduro himself are personally in charge of TDA, which there's no evidence of that, then they can accuse Venezuela of being a
state sponsor of terror.
State sponsor of terror.
State sponsor of... Holy fuck!
Oh my God. Remember this? That attack was used to justify bombing at least 16 countries over 2 decades and counting, directly killing nearly 1 million people while indirectly leading to the deaths of an additional 3.5 million according to a report by the Cost of War Project, engaging in regime change in the process, overthrowing several governments. Over the course of this global war on terror, they carried out thousands of airstrikes on virtually every group of military-aged males they could find, often hitting wedding parties or killing journalists, and showing as little regard for the presumption of innocence of their targets as Trump has lately in the Caribbean.
The turning point was 9/11. The tragedy is that these tactics, these strategies are being replicated by other regimes.
The initial US response to 9/11 was to go after the Taliban government.
The United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan,
who were at least somewhat involved in harboring Osama bin Laden in the years leading up to 9/11. But then the Bush administration spent months building a narrative on the foundation of either fabricated or non-existent evidence claiming that Iraq was a state sponsor of terror.
Saddam was a supporter of terrorism long before these terrorist networks had a name.
And that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein was building weapons of mass destruction and implying that he was somehow maybe involved in 9/11 or something. Now, it just so happens that the US had already been planning to invade Iraq long before 9/11. George W. Bush became president in January 2001, 8 months before 9/11. His first 2 National Security Council meetings discussed the possible invasion of Iraq. He was given briefing materials called Plan for a Post-Saddam Iraq. Why, might you ask? Well, the answer is in a Pentagon document from March 5th, 2001 called Foreign Suitors for Iraqi Oil Field Contracts. And it's not a coincidence that Bush's vice president, Dick Cheney, who was running most of the US's foreign policy behind the scenes, was an oil executive. And Halliburton, the company he was the CEO of, profited massively from the invasion of Iraq.
Don't get mixed up with drugs, gangs, or oil executives.
Iraq doesn't have the world's biggest oil reserves. They're close. They're number 4, right behind Iran at number 3 and Saudi Arabia at number 2. But you might be surprised to learn that the country with the largest oil reserves in the world isn't even in the Middle East. It's Venezuela.
We will drill, baby, drill.
Funny story, it was summer when I started working on this video. If you've been following Barely Informed for a while, you might have heard me talk about a really ambitious project I've been working on for nearly 2 years at this point. But I was feeling bad about how long it was going to take to finish that, so I decided to put it on hold and focus on something more manageable that I could put out quickly. So it's mid-September at that point, and I'm researching the Caribbean strikes that just started for a short, and I'm realizing that the stuff I'm finding is not going to fit in YouTube's 3-minute limit for shorts. So I decided to commit to that for a proper YouTube video that I figure I could have it finished in a couple of weeks at most. It's been 3 months. So if you're liking this video, you can thank, and I definitely have to thank, the people supporting Barely Informed on Patreon who allow me to go down these many long rabbit holes. I posted a video not too long ago about the struggles of independent journalism without funding, and I'll be honest with you, things are really tight right now, especially because this video specifically is almost definitely going to be demonetized. So if you want to help me do the best reporting I possibly can, please help support the channel by joining Patreon or becoming a YouTube member, or you can do individual donations on Ko-fi. The links for all of those are down below. But if you can't afford any of that, that's totally fine. You can still help the channel by subscribing, leaving a comment, and liking this video that we're going back to right now. If you needed an indication that all of this has very little to do with drugs and cartels beyond the fact that the Trump administration is contradicting its own intelligence agencies to manufacture the American people's consent for war. While Trump is on the warpath against Venezuela, which plays a relatively minor role in the international drug trade, he just pardoned an actual large-scale drug trafficker. The former president of Honduras, who was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in prison for smuggling an estimated 400 tons of cocaine into the US. The US government has long had its hand in Latin American politics, trying to prevent left-wing governments from cementing their grip on power, and in the process, over the years, they installed and supported brutal dictatorships that served US interests. For the longest time, the Latin American communist boogeyman was Cuba. Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, the decades-long embargo and sanctions. But they've been especially bitter towards Venezuela since Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, seized the assets of US oil companies in 2007. Well, the animosity didn't start then, but it was a turning point in US-Venezuela relations. After all, the US organized a coup and overthrew the government of Iran in the 1950s, when their democratic leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized their oil industry against the wishes of Western oil companies. So it's not like the US doesn't have a known history of regime change in cases like these. But even though that coup ended up backfiring spectacularly in the last 70 years, just like the US's regime change wars in Afghanistan and Iraq ended up being catastrophic on all fronts, even though the Trump administration has long claimed to be against starting any new wars.
I'm especially proud to be the first president in decades who has started no new wars.
In opposition to any and all regime change wars.
Regime change wars. Foreign policy regime change war
is a famous mantra of Trump's director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard.
We must stand united against those in both parties who never tire of war.
Regime change is indeed the stated goal in Venezuela. In 2020, the first Trump admin announced a $15 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Nicolas Maduro. And that was raised to $25 million by the Biden admin in January 2025, the same amount that was offered for Saddam Hussein in 2003. And in August, Trump doubled that.
Today, the Department of Justice and State Department are announcing a historic $50 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Nicolas Maduro.
And it's not like they're shy about the US's broader interests in Venezuela.
Venezuela. How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door. But now we're buying oil from Venezuela, so we're making a dictator very rich. Can you believe this? Nobody can believe it.
Venezuela, for the American oil companies, will be a field day because it will be more than $1 trillion in economic activity. American companies can go in and fix all the oil pipe, the whole oil rigs, and everything that has to do with the Venezuelan petroleum companies, or everything that has to do with oil and the derivatives. Number two, Venezuela has been the launching pad, the hub for our enemies. The Iranian, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Cubans, the Nicaraguans, people that hate the United States, and the only thing they want to do is do harm to us and to our young Americans.
Maduro uses foreign terrorist organizations like TDA, Sinaloa, and Cartel of the Suns to bring deadly drugs and violence into our country.
The scale and the overblowing of the situation out of proportion is what constitutes, I think, a novelty. But what you cannot do is to invoke self-defense under international law to confront what appears to be a number of isolated incidents concerning ordinary crime and ordinary criminals.
The dubious, unsubstantiated claims of terrorist associations, the regime change plans, the drone strikes, the gigantic reward for Maduro's capture. It feels right out of the war on terror from the early 2000s, except this time it's much closer to the US. And it's worth wondering what difference that proximity could make in terms of regional instability and refugee flows. Okay, at the time of recording this, the US hasn't started bombing Venezuela yet, although for the past couple of days it's been feeling like it could happen literally any minute. Trump has been ratcheting up the pressure for months, and earlier this week he announced that Venezuela's airspace is closed. Now, we know Maduro and Trump have been speaking on the phone to discuss how to avoid a conflict, and I'm gonna speculate just a little bit here. It is possible that much of this is posturing to pressure Maduro into agreeing to an extortionary deal granting US corporations privileged access to Venezuelan oil reserves. Just like Trump tried to leverage a peace deal in Ukraine to pressure Zelensky into buying US natural gas and granting the US privileged access to Ukrainian rare earth minerals. That part isn't speculation. We know he did that. He did it live on camera.
You know, we have security in a different form. We'll have workers there digging, taking the raw earth so that we can create a lot of great product in this country.
And the deal currently being negotiated is reported to be even more corrupt.
You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's
with
back
all the
to you.
respect to your
Far
country.
more than a lot of people said they
respect.
should have.
Have you said thank you once?
There's probably no terms Maduro could offer that would be generous enough for Trump to let him stay in office. What seems more likely at the moment is that he's going to want to install Venezuela's Trump-supporting opposition leader, Corina Machado, who's been calling on Trump to invade her country and dedicated her Nobel Peace Prize to him.
And tell our viewers why you decided to dedicate this award to President Donald Trump.
Because he deserves it.
We live in an insane time. A month ago, she reportedly met with US business leaders to discuss investment opportunities in Venezuela, which sounds insanely reminiscent of this foreign suitors for Iraqi oil field contracts document from the Bush administration. And just to be clear here, nothing I've said in this video is an endorsement or a defense of Maduro. I have no love for the Maduro or the Chavez regimes whatsoever. Just like I have no love for Saddam Hussein, but I hope we can all agree, at least in hindsight, that invading that country was a mistake. And even if you don't live in a region that is going to be directly under US bombs during this conflict, what the war on terror has taught us is that no matter where you live, it is only a matter of time before this war has a tangible impact on your day-to-day life as well. Of course, there were the global surveillance programs that came out of the war on terror, or the Patriot Act that expanded the definition of what was considered terrorism and allowed the government to detain immigrants indefinitely without a trial. But even more visible than that, the US military budget exploded after 9/11, reaching $752 billion in 2011. And that wasn't just to pay for the very expensive bombs they were dropping on the Middle East or the operational costs of occupying Iraq and Afghanistan while carrying out drone strikes in half a dozen other countries. They also replaced and modernized all of their equipment, from their fighter jets and Black Hawk helicopters all the way down to body armor and armored personnel carriers. Not that they really needed to, the US already had by far the best equipped military in the world, but it creates jobs, grows the economy, and makes a lot of people really, really rich to do that. The military was so well funded that it had a ton of extra equipment it didn't even need, which ended up in the hands of police departments in the US through programs like the 1033 and 1122 programs. Now, you might say, why would police need armored personnel carriers built to withstand fire from rocket launchers or MRAPs, mine-resistant vehicles, when there aren't any minefields in the US? Doesn't matter, because it looks really badass, and they've been using that not only in SWAT operations, but also on demonstrations. In fact, it started to become especially noticeable in the early days of the Black Lives Matter protests, like in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, after the police killing of Michael Brown. And get this, the defense budget Trump is proposing for next year is $1 trillion. A lot of the equipment that money buys is once again going to end up on US streets one way or another. Where am I going with this? After the war on terror has been devastating the entire Middle East for 2.5 decades, the Trump administration is starting a new war on terror right next door. And in doing so, they've stretched the definition of the word terrorism to justify killing basically whoever they want. And at home, they've just designated a new terrorist group to go after.
Over the last 10 years. Counting or not counting gang violence? Great.
Within minutes of a bullet hitting Charlie Kirk's neck on September 10th, the American right and the Trump administration were railing in unison against an amorphous radical left supposedly responsible for the shooting. And despite the fact that no concrete evidence has come out since tying Kirk's alleged shooter to any kind of radical leftist group or ideology, and even less evidence tying him to Antifa, Donald Trump seized the opportunity to do something that he'd been talking about since his first term. He declared Antifa a terrorist organization on September 22nd.
Under your leadership, President Trump, we're deploying the full might of the federal law enforcement to crack down on Antifa and other domestic terrorist organizations led by Stephen Miller. And Stephen, thank you for everything you're doing.
Hold on, you might think, why am I talking about Antifa in a video about Venezuela and cartels? Why am I making that connection? Well, I'm not making that connection. They are.
Fighting crime is more than just getting the bad guy off the streets. It's breaking down the organization brick by brick. Just like we did with cartels, we're going to take the same approach, President Trump, with Antifa. Destroy the entire organization from top to bottom.
So what is Antifa? There's a truism that is often repeated about them.
Antifa is an idea, not an organization.
Oh, you gotta be
not
kidding.
militia.
Antifa stands for anti-fascist, and therefore, if you're against fascism, you are Antifa. Memes have been circulating on social media portraying Indiana Jones and Brad Pitt's character from Inglourious Basterds as Antifa. And while that's kind of true, let's be honest, it's a little bit disingenuous. Because while there is no one organization called Antifa, it can be better thought of as an umbrella term for thousands of informal groups and activist networks from all over the world dedicated to monitoring, protesting, and fighting fascism wherever it pops up. When people think Antifa, they're not thinking Indiana Jones or random average people who don't like the far right. They're thinking of the often masked black bloc demonstrators, which is not a tactic exclusive to Antifa, nor is it representative of all of Antifa. But I've interviewed Antifa spokespersons over the years. I've gotten threatened by Antifa people for filming demonstrations as a journalist, so it's clearly more than just an idea. But even if the Trump administration had a narrow definition of Antifa aimed at violent demonstrators, branding them with the official designation of a terrorist organization is a concerning move, especially coming from a government that has close ties with actual organized paramilitary groups. And a president who pardoned 1.5 thousand people arrested for the violent assault of the US Capitol to overturn the result of
Stay in there, buddy. Mike, it's Jimmy. I'm here.
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left.
But the administration doesn't have a narrow definition of Antifa. The January 22nd executive order doesn't define it at all, but 3 days later they issued National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, or NSPM 7, called Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence, which directs the National Joint Terrorism Task Force to go after the so-called anti-fascist ideology, which it outlines with the following list. And tell me in the comments how many of these apply to you. Anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the US government, extremism on migration, race, and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality, whereas usually it's those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality that hold hostility towards the extremists on migration, race, and gender. This president has already been deploying unprecedented means to target his perceived enemies, especially immigrants, both undocumented and documented, and citizens suspected of being undocumented immigrants. He's stretching the definition of terrorism abroad to justify extrajudicial killings, and at home officially designating large swaths of his critics as terrorists within US borders.
I think it's a hallmark of authoritarianism to disqualify opponents, political opponents, as terrorists. For instance, LGBTI organizations have also been branded as terrorists in Russia, to the point that you generate rejection also domestically vis-a-vis these movements, these organizations, in support for the repressive violence that then is called for to sort of crack down on these now terrorist groups.
While the initial designation of Antifa as a terrorist organization didn't seem to hold much water, legally speaking, because of how vague it was, the administration has since declared several specific Antifa groups in Europe as foreign terrorist organizations, the same designation as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which the government has been applying to gangs and cartels in Latin America. And this could open the door to Trump prosecuting American alleged anti-fascists on charges of supporting supposed foreign terrorist groups. Meanwhile, he's openly toying with the idea of invoking the Insurrection Act, which would allow him to use military force on the American people and fully bring the war on terror home.